The crystal chandeliers of Miami's legendary Fontainebleau Hotel dripped gold over the grand ballroom. Every surface shimmered, white orchids lined the walls, roses climbed up golden columns, and flickering candles floated in glass bowls across mirrored tables. It was January 15th, 2019, the wedding day of billionaire real estate mogul Richard Alston, age 70, and his 22-year-old bride, Eleanor Reyes, a nursing student from Queens. Guests whispered about the age gap behind Ray's champagne flutes. Others stared at Eleanor with a blend of admiration and unease. She sat poised beside her new husband, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Her dark eyes were cast downward, her smile thin, the kind of smile that looked practiced, not felt. Her henna-stained hands shimmered with diamonds. Her long black hair framed a beauty so striking it silenced conversations. Until people began murmuring again. "She's number 6, right? I heard the last one vanished after a year. No one ever talks about them. Weird, right?" Across the room, Richard Alston, dressed in a crisp white tuxedo, observed his guests with icy satisfaction. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his posture rigid with control. To many, he was the embodiment of the American dream, a self-made tycoon who transformed abandoned Bronx blocks into glimmering towers, who dined with senators and celebrities alike. But behind the polished surface of his smile, something colder lurked. The wedding planner would later tell police, "It was the most beautiful wedding I'd ever organized, and the most horrifying ending I could have imagined." Less than 24 hours after the couple exchanged vows beneath a custom-built gold arch, the same ballroom would be eerily silent. White satin would be replaced by yellow crime scene tape. And instead of a photographer capturing joy, forensic experts would be photographing blood spatter across the marble tiles of a penthouse suite. But tonight, this moment was still dressed in illusion. As the band played a soft jazz rendition of "At Last, Eleanor," Reyes was dying inside. Every step toward the aisle had felt like walking toward her own funeral. She hadn't slept the night before. She'd barely eaten. And every time Richard's hand rested on her back, a cold sweat broke across her skin. Just 3 months ago, she had been sharing cafeteria fries with her boyfriend Ethan Patel after night classes. Now she was married to a man who had built empires but destroyed lives. But she couldn't turn back. Not now. Not after what had happened to her father. Not after the threats. The reception was a parade of excess. Golden lobster rolls, Dom Perignon flowing like tap water, a custom 7-tier cake crowned with sugar orchids that looked almost more alive than the bride. Eleanor's parents, Marcus and Lucia Reyes, sat at a side table, barely able to believe what they were seeing. Marcus's heart surgery had been paid in full, the hospital bills gone. They'd even been promised a new condo in Midtown. What price could possibly be too great to save a life? Lucia, however, couldn't shake the chill in her spine. She'd asked questions about Richard's past, about the other wives, but their matchmaker, the elegant and calculating Rachel Vaughn, had brushed her off with practiced charm. The previous marriages were cultural misunderstandings, Rachel had said, her tone honeyed. This one will be different. Eleanor is perfect for him, educated, beautiful, traditional, just what he needs in his later years. The first red flag should have been how fast everything moved. Within 10 days of their introduction, Richard had proposed via video call. Within 2 weeks, legal documents had been delivered to the Reyes apartment, contracts full of legalese that Marcus had barely understood. Rachel had assured them, "This is standard, just a prenup, all generous, all in your favor." But Eleanor had noticed something else, something darker. The insistence that she submit to a medical check, the way Rachel grew cold when Eleanor resisted, and then the forged document Rachel brought over herself. "This proves your purity," she said, slipping the sealed envelope into a file. Eleanor's stomach twisted. "I never agreed to that." "He doesn't need to know what's true," Rachel replied, eyes flat. "He just needs to believe it. Be smart." That night, Eleanor had texted Ethan in panic. She forged a virginity certificate. "I don't know what to do." He had called her instantly. "Eleanor, listen to me. Come here tonight. I'll book you a ticket to San Diego." "Leave this madness." "I can't. They'll hurt my dad again." "It's too late. Run anyway. Please, forget the money." "I love you," she typed. "But some things are beyond even love." Then she blocked his number. Now, sitting beside her husband, Eleanor could feel the invisible chains tightening. The world thought she was the luckiest girl alive, marrying into one of the most powerful families in the country. But inside, she felt like an artifact bought and displayed, not a wife, an acquisition, a trophy. The first time she saw Lena Martinez, a soft-spoken housekeeper assigned to their floor, she felt something shift. Lena was the only face at the hotel that didn't look rehearsed, the only one who, upon bringing fresh towels, had looked her in the eye and whispered, "If you need anything, I'm on shift all night. Just dial housekeeping. No questions asked." Eleanor's eyes had flooded instantly. She nodded, blinking away tears before Richard turned around. As the evening wore on, Richard gave a speech charming, crisp, devoid of real warmth. "Eleanor has made me the happiest man in Miami," he said to thunderous applause. But across the room, someone whispered, "He said the same thing at the last wedding." Eleanor barely noticed the toast. Her thoughts were consumed with what came next. Rachel's final words echoed in her mind like a curse. "Please him, and your life will be easy. Disappoint him, and I can't protect you." Around 11:45 p.m., the guests began to leave. Eleanor was ushered to her suite, the penthouse escorted by Richard himself. His grip on her arm was possessive, not tight but unmistakably controlling. The hallway stretched like a tunnel. The elevator ride felt like an execution march. And when the suite doors closed behind them, the air inside changed instantly. Gone was the charming host. "Now," Richard said, his voice flat, "we begin our real life together." Eleanor didn't speak. She didn't move. But she didn't know that just 2 doors down, Lena Martinez was still on duty. She had returned to the floor after hearing strange sounds, a faint muffled crash earlier, then silence. Something didn't sit right. And though she didn't yet know it, within the next hour she would become the only person capable of bringing Eleanor's killer to justice. The door of the Fontainebleau's royal penthouse clicked shut behind them with a sound that made Eleanor flinch. It was barely audible, yet to her it felt final, like the sound of a key turning inside a lock, sealing away her freedom. The luxury that surrounded her, marble floors, velvet curtains, an entire wall of ocean-facing glass, suddenly felt like an opulent prison. Richard Alston stood in silence for a moment, still in his wedding tuxedo, slowly removing his cufflinks with a surgeon's precision. His demeanor had shifted. The warm host who shook hands, kissed babies, and made business deals in velvet tones had evaporated. What remained was something colder, sterile, like a man preparing to dissect something he owned. "Champagne?" he asked, without looking at her. It wasn't a question. Eleanor hesitated. "No, thank you." Richard's head tilted ever so slightly, and then without comment he poured 2 glasses. She watched as he pulled a small amber vial from his jacket pocket and tipped a few drops into one of them before swirling it once. "For relaxation," he said, handing her the glass. Eleanor took it, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'm really tired." "Drink," he said again softly, but with an unmistakable shift in tone. She lifted the glass to her lips and took a small sip. It tasted normal, sweet even. But the moment the liquid touched her stomach, something felt off. Not immediate, but enough to make her senses begin to fuzz at the edges. Richard stepped away, placing his untouched glass on a marble table as he circled her slowly. "You understand your purpose here?" "Yes," he asked, still not touching her. Eleanor nodded numbly. "You are wife number 6, he continued, his voice quiet, controlled. "There is a reason the others didn't last." "I hope to please you," Eleanor whispered, repeating the line Rachel Vaughn had drilled into her like a script. She felt it leave her mouth like a betrayal of everything she was. "We shall see," he said. Then came the moment she had been dreading since the engagement. "Remove your robe." Her skin flushed cold. She turned away slightly. I'd like to speak with you first." She tried, but Richard was no longer listening. What followed was not intimacy. It was an inspection, a transaction. Richard moved with the emotionless precision of a man evaluating merchandise, his eyes critical, his touch clinical. His fingers brushed across her collarbones, her shoulders tracing invisible lines of ownership. "You will not appear in public without my approval of your attire," he said calmly. "You will not speak to other men without my permission. You will not leave our residence without a chaperone." "Yes," Eleanor replied, fighting the growing dizziness in her head. The champagne, or whatever had been in it, was beginning to take hold. Her vision blurred slightly as she tried to stay upright. Then his voice hardened. "We will consummate this marriage, now." He reached for her, and that was when everything unraveled. As he touched her, something changed in his face. His hand froze mid-motion. His eyes narrowed like a hawk spotting an error in flight. He pulled back. "You're not a virgin," he said. "Not a question of declaration." Eleanor's breath caught. Please, I can explain. Explain, his voice spiked. You lied to me. No, she gasped. Rachel, I didn't know about the certificate. Do not speak her name, Richard shouted, grabbing her by the shoulder so hard she whimpered. Who was he? Tell me now. Panic surged. Her mouth opened before her mind caught up. His name is Ethan. We were going to be married, but my family. That's when his hand struck her. It landed across her face with such force that her vision went white. She fell sideways, crashing into a crystal side table. Glass shattered. Pain shot through her cheek and her ribs. You dare speak of another man on our wedding night? He whispered low and deadly. Eleanor tried to crawl backward, but blood from a fresh gash on her temple blurred her vision. It was before I met you, she pleaded. I didn't mean to. You have made a fool of me, Richard snarled. Do you know what happens to women who make fools of powerful men in this country? Then as he stepped forward to grab her again, his bare foot landed squarely on a large shard of crystal. He gasped briefly, thrown off by the pain. It was her only chance. Eleanor bolted for the door, her bare feet slipping slightly on the marble. Her fingers closed around the ornate brass handle, but before she could turn it, his weight slammed into her from behind, like a falling boulder. Where do you think you're going? He growled into her ear, pinning her with one hand while the other wrapped around her throat. That's when the beating began. His rage, no longer verbal, became physical. He slammed her against the wall, dragged her by the hair across the floor, and cursed her with every word that left his mouth. You think you can fight me, he shouted, as she clawed at him, biting down on his hand as he tried to silence her screams. She managed to grab a crystal vase and swing it, glanced off his shoulder but did little damage. You would strike your husband? He said, his voice eerily calm. Now I will show you the consequences of such disrespect. She fought harder, kicking and screaming. Her hand found a letter opener on a desk. She swung it blindly behind her. It caught his cheek. Blood spurted. He howled. They stood there for a moment, both breathing heavily, the ruined suite between them, a battlefield. You are dead, he said quietly. Then he lunged. The letter opener flew from her grasp as they fell. His hands found her throat again this time, tighter, more intentional. Eleanor thrashed beneath him, struggling to breathe, her vision shrinking to a pinpoint of light. I paid for you, he whispered, his face inches from hers. You were mine. Her body stopped moving. Her eyes glassed over. And he didn't let go. Not even after her pulse had stopped. Not for a full minute after. When Richard finally rose, he straightened his collar and looked at her body on the marble floor with the same detachment he might show to a broken vase. No regret, no horror, only a problem to be handled. He walked to the phone, calm, controlled. Omar, he said when his assistant picked up, come to the royal suite. We have a situation. When Omar Taylor arrived at the royal suite, he didn't need to ask questions. He had served Richard Alston for over 15 years. From negotiating city permits for luxury high-rises to bearing bad press after a scandalous divorce, Omar had been the man behind the curtain. But nothing prepared him for what he found that night. The door to the penthouse opened quietly. Richard stood inside, backlit by the soft glow of chandelier light, reflecting off broken glass. His shirt was untucked, the white streaked with faint smudges of red. His expression was unreadable, controlled, cold. Omar stepped in his polished shoes, crunching lightly over tiny shards of crystal. Then he saw her. Eleanor Reyes lay crumpled near the bedroom entrance, her silk bridal robe torn open at the shoulder, blood trickling down from a jagged gash on her forehead. Her mouth was slightly open. Her eyes stared unblinking at the ceiling. Omar inhaled, not sharply, not loudly, but deeply, like a man adjusting his equilibrium in the middle of a hurricane. What happened? He asked, voice carefully neutral. Richard didn't turn around. She was impure. Omar waited. She became violent, Richard added. I defended myself. It was the kind of line that sounded rehearsed, a phrase Richard had likely used before. Like the calm statement a wolf makes after mauling a sheep and then wondering why its mouth tastes of blood. Omar nodded slowly, his mind already scanning possibilities. The body, the suite, the story. What do you need me to do? Richard turned to face him then. Make this look like an accident, something believable, then make sure it stays quiet. The suite was chaos. Furniture overturned, a coffee table smashed, blood on the floor, the shattered remnants of a crystal vase. There were bruises on Eleanor's throat, handprints. Too much evidence, but also too much money, too much power, and too many people who would look the other way if handled correctly. Omar walked calmly through the room, scanning like a surgeon surveying damage before an operation. He paused outside the master bathroom. Inside, a marble-soaking tub gleamed under dim lighting. Polished steps led into it like an altar. "This will work," he said. "We'll say she slipped, hit her head, fell unconscious, drowned." Richard leaned against the wall. "Good." "The bruises?" Omar asked, eyeing the dark marks across her throat. "The edge of the tub," Richard said flatly. "We'll say she struck it falling forward. The water will obscure everything else." There was no hesitation in his tone, no remorse, just cold strategy. Omar nodded. "You should go now. Before anyone sees you, I'll handle the cleanup." Richard fixed his cuffs. "I'll be at the Palm residence. Text me once it's handled. Make sure hotel management understands the need for privacy." "Of course." Richard left the suite through the private service elevator, the same one VIPs used to avoid paparazzi. Not a single hotel guest saw him leave. But what neither of them realized was that someone had already seen more than either could have imagined. In the service corridor behind the kitchens and linen closets, housekeeper Lena Martinez was frozen in place, her back pressed against a wall. Her heart thundered inside her chest like a drumbeat of warning. She had entered the suite minutes earlier, after hearing a crash while delivering fresh towels to the adjacent room. When no one responded at the door, her instincts told her something was wrong. She used her master key to slip through the service entrance, the back door rarely used, just in time to hear Omar and Richard discussing how to arrange the scene. She had seen Eleanor's body. She had heard everything. And now she stood hidden just feet away, clutching her phone with trembling hands, staring through the slight gap in the doorway as the two men planned to cover up like they were redecorating a living room. She couldn't breathe, but somehow she steadied her fingers and hit record. "We'll say she slipped," Omar said again on the recording. "We position her like she hit the tub. Blood can be washed. Water will distort the bruises. Make sure it's done before morning," Richard replied. She recorded almost 2 minutes before slowly backing into the hallway. Once safely in the staff corridor, she bolted not toward security, not toward the lobby, but toward the employee locker room. There she pulled out a prepaid phone she kept hidden in her backpack. She uploaded the file to an encrypted cloud account she had used once before, when a former maid was fired for reporting a manager who harassed her. Then she deleted the video from her phone. It was done. But her legs were still shaking. Her mouth was dry, and her instincts screamed at her to disappear, to run, to never speak of what she'd seen. But she remembered Eleanor's face, the silent cry for help, the way she had clutched her wrist during the towel delivery just hours ago. Lena thought of her own younger sister back in San Antonio. If it had been her, she couldn't walk away. At 5:17 a.m., hotel management placed the emergency call. "Tragic accident," they told police. "Bride fell in the tub, drowned." They emphasized discretion, prestige, reputation. Detectives were told that Richard Alston was too devastated to speak. Lead responder. Lieutenant Pierce took one look at the luxurious suite and nodded without question. Omar Taylor was already there, hands folded solemnly, speaking in a low, respectful tone. She was tired. She went to take a bath after the reception. "We believe she slipped. The marble steps are steep. The water was running when I arrived." It was a clean script. The room had been scrubbed, the floor re-waxed, a new coffee table delivered, furniture rearranged. The scene looked ordinary, until a call came through from police headquarters. The case was being reassigned, effective immediately. The lead detective would now be Detective Arjun Malik. Omar's face didn't show it, but his pulse ticked up. "May I ask why?" he asked the officer. "Malik specializes in foreign national cases," came the reply. "Standard procedure." But Omar knew better. Malik had a reputation, and reputations made people nervous. At 6:07 a.m., Detective Malik entered the suite. He said nothing at first, just scanned the room, pausing at every detail. The faint drag marks near the bathroom, a small smear on the doorknob, the pattern of water in the tub. Then he looked at Eleanor's body, at the bruises on her throat. "These don't look like fall injuries," he said flatly. "These look like manual strangulation." Omar stepped forward. "Detective, with all due respect, the bride was unstable. It was a long, emotional night. Maybe she—" Mr. Taylor Malik interrupted. "This is now a homicide investigation. Please wait outside while we secure the scene." Omar didn't move at first, but the look in Malik's eyes left no room for negotiation. By 9 a.m., a preliminary report had been filed: suspicious death, possible foul play, investigation ongoing. Word spread quickly and pressure began mounting from above. This case cannot go public, whispered a voice on the phone to Malik's chief that afternoon. Richard Alston's brother-in-law sits on the Senate Commerce Committee. But Malik had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He had seen Eleanor's wounds, and he'd seen enough cover-ups in his career to know when a storm was coming. That's when his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. I have evidence about what happened to the bride. Meet me at the Starbucks on Biscayne BLVD, 5:00 p.m. Detective Arjun Malik sat in his unmarked SUV outside the Starbucks on Biscayne Boulevard engine, off eyes scanning every passerby. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel, not out of impatience but calculation. He didn't know who he was meeting, only that the message had come from a burner number and included one chilling promise. I have evidence about what happened to the bride. The moment he stepped into the coffee shop, he saw her. Lena Martinez, dressed in civilian clothes, her hair pulled into a tight bun, sat at the far corner table. Her hands were locked around a small to-go cup that had long gone cold. Her eyes darted toward the door, once then down at her lap. Malik approached, slowly flashing his badge just enough to let her know this wasn't a trap. Ms. Martinez, yeah, she swallowed hard. You're the one who took the case. I am. Then I hope to God you mean it. Without another word, she reached into her coat and slid a USB drive across the table. It's all there, she whispered. 2 minutes of audio. I caught them talking about how to cover it up. Like it was no big deal. Like moving furniture. They said she was impure, that he had to make it look like an accident. Who Malik asked, though he already knew. Richard Alston and his assistant Omar Taylor. Malik pocketed the drive already, knowing this changed everything. Why come to me, he asked. Because I watched that girl get walked into a gilded cage, Lena said. She asked for help with her eyes. I gave her my number, and then she died the same night. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't breathe. And I knew, her voice cracked. I knew if I stayed quiet, I'd be just like them. Malik stood, signaling the meeting was over. You just made yourself a target, he said. Be careful. He walked out with the USB clutched like a detonator. Back at headquarters, Malik entered the lab, personally handing the USB to a tech he trusted. No chain of command, he warned. No backups on the server. View only. Inside the tiny screening room, the audio file loaded. The voices were crystal clear. Richard? Make it look like an accident. Something believable. Omar, the tub. She hit her head. We can say she slipped. Richard. The bruises, Omar. The edge of the tub. Richard. Then make sure hotel management keeps it quiet. Malik sat back, breath shallow. This wasn't circumstantial anymore. It was conspiracy, murder, and premeditated cover-up. He forwarded the file encrypted to the public prosecutor's office with a single message. Urgent request authorization for formal charges, audio evidence enclosed. But word doesn't stay quiet for long. A British journalist named Amelia Dunn in Miami, covering a tech summit, had overheard hotel staff whispering. She filed a breaking article within hours. Billionaire bride found dead in luxury suite, foul play suspected. The article exploded across the internet. Within 24 hours, hashtags were trending. Tilanarenon, Woodyarenmen, justice for Eleanor, or one term, Richard Alston. Kasashuri was cover up in Miami. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, they all wanted answers. In New York, protesters gathered outside Alston's Midtown skyscraper, chanting for justice. In Queens, neighbors lit candles outside the Reyes family apartment. She was trying to become a nurse, one neighbor told reporters. She wanted to help people not end up in some billionaire's body count. Meanwhile, inside City Hall, pressure mounted from the other direction. Alston's attorney sent legal threats to multiple news outlets. His brother-in-law, Senator Victor Greystone, made calls behind the scenes to contain the damage. But the fire was spreading too fast, and the evidence was too strong. In a private interview room at the public prosecutor's office, Malik sat across from Omar Taylor, the billionaire's right-hand man. Omar wore his usual polished expression, but Malik could see the cracks beginning to form. Accessory to murder, Malik said plainly. Conspiracy to obstruct justice. Tampering with a crime scene. You'll get 20 years minimum. Omar said nothing. Unless you talk. Still silence. Malik stood and placed a Bluetooth speaker on the table. Then he hit play. Richard's voice filled the room. She was impure. I defended myself. Make it look like an accident. Omar's eyes shut, his breath hitched. You know how this works, Malik said. First one to turn gets the deal. 10 seconds of silence passed. Then Omar opened his eyes. I'll testify. With Lena's recording and Omar's testimony, Malik built a timeline that left little room for doubt. Forensic evidence had already contradicted the bathtub story now, With corroboration, the case was airtight. The Reyes family was notified immediately. Marcus Reyes collapsed upon hearing the update, a mix of relief and renewed grief. Lucia, silent for days, finally sobbed openly when she heard the word murder spoken aloud. And Eleanor's brother Adrian posted a single sentence to social media that went viral. "You tried to silence her. Now the world's listening." October 15th, 2019. Richard Alston arrived at the Miami-Dade courthouse flanked by 5 attorneys. Across the courtroom, the Reyes family sat in mourning attire, joined by a representative from the Indian American Legal Foundation, human rights observers, and Lena seated quietly in the back, eyes sharp and focused. The defense painted Eleanor as emotionally unstable, claiming she attacked Alston after he learned of her deception. But the prosecution dropped bomb after bomb. Omar's live testimony, Lena's audio recording, recovered text messages to Ethan. "I'm terrified, but this is the only way my father will live." Then came the final blow. Dr. Hannah Martin, a forensic psychologist, took the stand. Richard Alston's behavior follows the textbook pattern of coercive control grooming, isolation, dominance, and ultimately violence when that control is challenged. Discovering Eleanor had a past relationship did not provoke heartbreak. It triggered a perceived loss of ownership. When the jury listened to the recording of Richard's voice saying, "You were mine to do with, as I pleased," even some of his staunchest allies couldn't meet his gaze. On December 3rd, 2019, the verdict was delivered. Guilty, first-degree murder, sentenced to 25 years without parole. Gas filled the courtroom. Richard Alston, once untouchable, was led away in handcuffs. Behind him, the camera flash bulbs exploded like fireworks. But no one could outshine the quiet dignity of Lucia Reyes clutching her daughter's photo. The aftershocks came quickly. Federal legislation was introduced requiring background checks for international marriage arrangements. Rachel Vaughn, the broker, was arrested in Chicago and charged with human trafficking. Ethan Patel, Eleanor's ex-boyfriend, established the Eleanor Reyes Foundation, funding legal support for women in forced marriages. Lena Martinez received asylum in Canada and began speaking out about labor exploitation and human trafficking. "Silence protects monsters," Lena said in her first televised interview. "One voice can shatter the whole machine." But the most enduring image came from a candlelight vigil held in Central Park 1 year after Eleanor's death. Thousands of women in white stood shoulder to shoulder. In the center, a photograph of Eleanor smiling, radiant, unafraid, beside an inscription chosen by her mother. Her sacrifice brought safety to others. 2 weeks after the verdict, the Miami skyline returned to its glittering facade. Tourists wandered along Ocean Drive with frozen drinks in hand, and the news cycle churned to the next crisis. But behind closed doors in courtrooms and government offices from Washington to Mumbai, the shock waves of Eleanor Reyes' murder were still unfolding. Detective Arjun Malik sat in his office late one evening, bathed in the cold glow of overhead lights, reviewing the final case report. The details still clawed at him, the bruises, the forged certificate, the predator cloaked in Armani suits. But what haunted him most wasn't the brutality. It was how close it had all come to being buried. One less mate on duty. One less detective willing to ask questions. One more bribe, and it would have been ruled accidental drowning. "Some cases change the investigator," he whispered aloud, closing the file. "But the important ones, they change society." In the weeks that followed, Lena Martinez, the hotel staffer who had risked her life to record Richard Alston, and Omar Taylor received asylum in Vancouver, Canada, under emergency protection for whistleblowers. Even before her flight took off from Miami International, she had already become a symbol. CNN called her the maid who shattered a billionaire's alibi. BuzzFeed called her the voice of justice. But Lena didn't see herself as a hero. "I just did what I would want someone to do for my little sister," she told a Canadian radio host. "I didn't think I'd make it out of Miami alive." She began speaking at conferences across North America, advocating for migrant worker protections, pushing for background checks on foreign employers, and exposing the loopholes that allowed men like Richard to prey on desperate families. "He bought her with paperwork," Lena said at a Harvard panel. "And until someone breaks the cycle, it'll happen again. Different face, same monster." In Washington, D.C., the case created a storm. Senator Marianne Coleman, chair of the Committee on Human Rights, held a press conference announcing a bipartisan bill, the International Marriage Protection Act, MPO. The bill proposed sweeping reforms. Mandatory background checks on any U.S. citizen over age 50, applying for a spousal visa involving a bride under 30. Certified psychological assessments for both parties. Counseling and interview sessions conducted privately with the bride before entry approval. whistleblower protections for domestic workers in high-risk employment. Eleanor Reyes was not a casualty, Senator Coleman declared. She was a victim of systemic neglect, and that stops now. The bill passed the House with 287 votes. Within 2 months, it was signed into law. Meanwhile, in India, Eleanor's case lit fires across public discourse. The Times of India called her the martyr of modern marriage trafficking. Protests erupted outside the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, with signs reading, "Dowry by another name is still exploitation. Justice for Eleanor is justice for us all." Indian Prime Ministerial spokesperson issued a statement demanding justice and cooperation, though by then Richard Alston had already been sentenced and the case had made international headlines. Back in Mumbai, local authorities began cracking down on fraudulent marriage brokers. Rachel Vaughn, the polished American matchmaker who had approached the Reyes family, was tracked down and arrested at her Chicago office after a months-long investigation. It turned out she wasn't just a one-off opportunist. She was part of a multi-million-dollar trafficking ring. Over a dozen women, mostly from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and rural Southeast Asia, came forward describing nearly identical experiences. Promises of support and education, pressure to forge purity certificates, isolation in luxurious apartments cut off from family. Rachel cut a deal to avoid a lifetime sentence, testifying in exchange for naming clients dozens of high-profile men across the U.S. and Gulf states. They didn't want wives, she told the court. They wanted property. One of those clients was under federal investigation within days of Rachel's testimony, a Republican donor from Texas. Another was a Los Angeles tech CEO. But the fallout didn't end there. In Miami, the Eleanor Reyes Foundation launched with a quiet ceremony at a Midtown community center. The keynote speaker, Ethan Patel, Eleanor's former boyfriend, he stood at the podium holding back tears, a photo of Eleanor beside him. "She once told me she wanted to heal people," Ethan began. "She was studying nursing, working night shifts, helping her dad with hospital bills, and in the end, she gave her future to save her family. Her story ended, but her mission doesn't have to." The foundation offered legal aid for women trapped in abusive marriages, counseling for families facing predatory matchmaker schemes, emergency shelters in India and the U.S. for women escaping coercion. Eleanor saved lives, Ethan finished. She just didn't live to see it. At the Fontainebleau Hotel, management quietly renovated the royal suite where Eleanor had been murdered. New furniture, new marble, new room number. They thought it would erase the past, but it didn't. Not for the housekeepers who still whispered her name. Not for Lena, who still remembered the cold weight of that towel card outside the door. Not for Detective Malik, who passed by the hotel sometimes just to remember why he kept fighting the battles no one wanted. 1 year later, thousands gathered in Central Park for the first annual Eleanor Vigil. Women in white, candlelight flickering like silent screams across the night. At the center stood a portrait, Eleanor smiling radiant, unafraid beneath the words chosen by her mother. Her sacrifice brought safety to others. Detective Malik stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in his coat pockets, watching in silence. A young girl no older than Eleanor had been when she met Richard stepped to the microphone and recited part of Eleanor's final message to Ethan. "Some things are beyond even love, but never beyond justice." The crowd was silent, and then they applauded, not loud, not triumphant, but deeply like a prayer finally answered. The morning after the verdict, the front page of the New York Times was stark. Billionaire guilty, Richard Alston, convicted of first-degree murder in bride's death. Underneath it, a photo captured the exact moment Richard Alston, real estate magnate, socialite, and pillar of American capitalism, was led away in handcuffs, his expression blank, no fury, no regret. Just a man who had built towers of glass and steel, only to see them crash around him with a single verdict. But behind the headlines, another story had already begun. The fall of a king. In the offices of Alston Properties, panic spread like wildfire. The firm had been one of the most powerful private real estate companies in the United States, owning more than 40 buildings in Manhattan alone, including luxury high-rises, hotels, and tech campuses. Now, overnight, its founder had become the face of murder and misogyny. By mid-morning, investors started pulling out. Hedge funds dumped their holdings. Tenants threatened to break leases. Then came the real death knell. The New York City Housing Board announced an emergency review of all permits granted to Alston's developments, including a stalled waterfront project that had long drawn accusations of corruption. If even a fraction of what the court heard is true, one board member said on live television, then every building with Alston's name on it should be audited. The company's stocks, though privately held, were tied up in funds and trusts. By the end of the day, three of its top executives had resigned. By the end of the week, bankruptcy proceedings had begun. The story of Richard's rise and fall flooded streaming platforms and talk shows. Netflix announced a docuseries within days. Every tabloid, every podcast, every legal analyst dissected the details. The forged virginity certificate, the bribed officials, the cover-up, the voice recording. But what riveted people most were the victims who emerged from the shadows. A Bangladeshi woman, Amira, came forward to a BBC journalist revealing she had been Richard's third wife 8 years earlier. "I was 19, she said. He kept me in a penthouse. My phone was monitored. I wasn't allowed to speak to hotel staff. When I asked to go back to my family, he said I was spoiled goods and sent me home with a broken jaw." A former chauffeur, now retired, told a Miami Herald reporter, "I saw bruises. I saw women crying. I told myself it wasn't my business. God forgive me." Suddenly, Richard Alston's legacy wasn't luxury. It was systemic abuse hidden behind marble and money. Meanwhile, in prison, Richard remained silent. He refused interviews, ignored requests from the press, never issued a statement. But Omar Taylor, his former assistant turned state witness, had plenty to say. In a plea deal that reduced his sentence, Omar provided prosecutors with names, dates, and financial trails, all leading to a network of high-profile men who had paid for exactly what Richard wanted: young, docile wives from vulnerable backgrounds. The feds moved fast. Within weeks, a Florida state senator was indicted on charges of illegal trafficking through marriage brokering. A Manhattan plastic surgeon who had performed undocumented procedures on Richard's previous wives was arrested. A tech investor in Los Angeles was forced to resign after connections surfaced with Rachel Vaughn's matchmaking business. It was no longer just about Eleanor. It was about a pattern, a system, and one man's conviction had become the loose thread that unraveled it all. In Queens, the Reyes family kept their heads low. Lucia stopped giving interviews. Marcus, still recovering from the emotional toll, rarely left the apartment. Adrian, Eleanor's brother, focused on the foundation and finishing his final year of high school. "She didn't die in vain," he told a classmate. "She tore the whole damn thing down." At the Eleanor Reyes Foundation, stories poured in. Letters, emails, cries for help. One came from a girl in Ohio, age 17, who said her parents were trying to force her into a marriage with a man in Dubai she'd never met. Another from a woman in Georgia who had escaped an abusive husband and needed legal protection. The foundation's small staff, only 5 full-time, worked around the clock to meet the growing needs. Donations flooded in, and Ethan Patel began speaking across college campuses, urging people to recognize the warning signs of coercive relationships. "It doesn't always look like abuse," he told a crowd at NYU. "Sometimes it looks like a fairy tale wedding. Sometimes it smells like roses and sounds like violin music. But the silence behind it, that's where the violence begins." Senator Marianne Coleman, now spearheading a national task force, introduced an amendment to the IMPA Act requiring that every international marriage involving a U.S. citizen be reviewed by an independent board if the age difference exceeded 20 years. "Consent is meaningless if it's coerced," she said, "and money should never replace morality." The amendment passed the Senate floor 64-36. It wasn't enough to save Eleanor, but it was enough to stop the next Eleanor from ever being bought. At the Fontainebleau hotel room, service staff now left a single white rose in every suite on the 43rd floor. Unofficially, it was known as the Eleanor flower, a gesture by the staff, not the management. Every year on January 15th, the day of her wedding, hotel staff gathered in silence near the penthouse elevator. No press, no posts, just memory. And somewhere in the background, Lena Martinez, now settled safely in Vancouver, would light a candle in her window. One flame, one vow. Silence protects the powerful, but memory arms the powerless. One evening, as spring bloomed across Central Park, Detective Arjun Malik received a letter without a return address. Inside was a photo of Eleanor at her NYU white coat ceremony, smiling, holding her nursing school certificate. On the back, scrawled in careful slanted handwriting, "She wanted to heal people. You made sure she still does." 3 years had passed. Yet in the corridors of justice, Eleanor Reyes' name still echoed, not as a headline, not as a hashtag, but as a legacy. In March 2022, New York State Legislature introduced a bill called the Eleanor Act, designed to reform laws around international matchmaking services. At its heart was a singular mission to ensure that no woman, regardless of background, could ever be commodified under the illusion of a fairy tale. We're not just criminalizing brokers, said Assemblywoman Natalia Cruz. We're criminalizing the business of deception, the machine that sold Eleanor as property. By the end of the year, 12 states had passed similar versions. Background checks were now mandatory. Mental health evaluations were required. And most importantly, every woman applying for an international marriage visa now underwent a confidential in-person interview with an independent human rights advocate. This change, quiet but seismic, was born not in a courtroom or a chamber, but in a moment of raw, unbearable truth, a young woman murdered in her wedding dress because she refused to be owned. Across the globe, on the first anniversary of Eleanor's death, a movement began. What started as a simple post by the Eleanor Reyes Foundation, a photo of her smiling with the caption, "She deserved more," sparked a wildfire of remembrance. Soon, cities across the US, India, Canada, and the UK held Eleanor vigils every January 15th. The scenes were always the same. Thousands of women dressed in white, candles in hand, silence held like prayer. In Mumbai, where Eleanor's mother was born, 10,000 people gathered in Azad Maidan, holding posters that read, "She gave her life to save her father. Let's not waste that gift." In Toronto, women from immigrant communities wept openly, some clutching photos of daughters they'd once forced into unwanted marriages and who never came home. And in Queens, at the very apartment complex where Eleanor had grown up, her younger brother Adrian stood at a podium overlooking the basketball court she used to walk past every morning on her way to school. "People ask what justice looks like," Adrian said. "It looks like this. Not prison bars, not headlines. It looks like prevention, like courage, like candles lit in cities my sister never got to visit." In Miami, Detective Arjun Malik returned to the Fontainebleau Hotel on what would have been Eleanor's 26th birthday. He wasn't there for a case. He was there because Lena Martinez had flown in her first return to the city since testifying. They met quietly in the hotel's garden terrace. The sun had just dipped behind the skyline, casting a golden hue across the horizon. Lena handed him a letter. It had been mailed anonymously to the Eleanor Foundation. Inside were screenshots of chat messages from a woman in South Carolina, trapped in an arranged marriage with an older foreign businessman. She had seen the Netflix docuseries, recognized the same grooming techniques, the same forged purity tests, the same silent rules. And she ran. She found shelter. She got out, Lena said softly, because of Eleanor. Malik stared at the page. The words blurred slightly. "That's what justice looks like," he finally said. "One woman's story, saving another." Later that night, Lena visited Suite 4312, the room where it had happened. The door had been repainted, the furniture replaced, the marble retiled, but she could still feel it, the memory carved into air. She stood in silence for nearly 20 minutes, then reached into her bag and placed a single white rose on the bedside table alongside a folded slip of paper. On it was written, "I saw you, I did something, and I'll never stop." At the University of Miami, a new lecture series launched, the Eleanor Reyes Chair in Gender, Power, and Law. The first guest speaker, Ethan Patel. His voice shook as he faced the auditorium full of law students. "Eleanor taught me that silence is the accomplice of cruelty. She lived in a world where she had to choose between love and survival, and she chose to save everyone but herself." He looked out at the crowd. "So now it's our turn, to be the people who see the signs, who listen, who intervene, and who never ever let silence win." 2 weeks later, a group of former maids from Gulf countries filed a joint lawsuit against a matchmaking firm based in California, the first of its kind. Their stories echoed Eleanor's, branded as brides, isolated in luxury, controlled under the guise of love. One of the plaintiffs said, "We were told it was a dream, but Eleanor helped us wake up." Even in prison, Richard Alston couldn't escape her name. Fellow inmates referred to him only as the groom. Guards refused to look him in the eye. Family members of other prisoners openly called for his sentence to be doubled, not out of vengeance, but as a message to others like him. In an unmarked cell in upstate New York, Richard sat day after day reading and rereading the same outdated Wall Street Journal. No more dinners with senators, no more private elevators. Only time and silence, and the memory of a girl who had died with fire still in her eyes. In spring 2023, a statue was unveiled in Queensbridge Park, not far from Eleanor's childhood home. It was simple, modest. A young woman's head held high, arms folded over a nursing textbook. On the base were 4 words chosen by Lena, Adrian, and Ethan together. "She did not bow." That night, as the sun set behind the East River, people gathered with candles once more. Among them were women who had escaped, girls who had been protected, activists who had been inspired, and at the very center stood Lucia Reyes, Eleanor's mother, holding the hands of two young girls' daughters of a woman who had fled from Texas, rescued by the foundation just months before. Lucia bent down to whisper to them, "My daughter didn't just save your mother. She saved you." And as the girls leaned into her arms, a breeze swept through the park carrying the smell of roses, the sound of laughter from the street behind them, and the quiet, undeniable truth. Eleanor Reyes would never be forgotten.